A cartographer story. How many here have ever heard of a cartographer story? All right, wow, that's really encouraging. Yeah. Is it only because you saw the title of this talk and that's what you think I'm talking about? Okay, well, the Cartographer story is a website that Daniel Huffman and I have put together. Is there anyone in the crowd who've actually contributed a story to a Cartographer story? Yes, very good, great, thank you. Thank you. Well, let's get into it. So it was created by Daniel Huffman and myself, John Nelson. I'm introducing Daniel, and Daniel's going to introduce me. So 2 truths and a lie. Daniel Huffman is single-handedly responsible for the entirety of the cartographic work in an atlas. He was featured as a cartographer on CBS's Sunday Morning. Beautifully. Great. I don't know if it's true, though. Daniel Huffman is the identity of a baby boy who died in 1939 in rural Michigan, and the being next to me is over 300 years old and assumes a new identity every couple decades when it's no longer possible for him to sustain his unlikely appearance of youth.
Now I will have to kill all of you for knowing that secret. What are you going to do?
Here's Daniel Huffman, a photo of Daniel. It's actually very hard to get a picture of Daniel. We had to hunt and hunt. And, oh, sorry, let me adjust the lighting on this. There's Daniel.
Yeah, and this is John. He resembles that person right there, sort of in the corner of that photograph. Let's see, 2 truths and a lie. John has been unfailingly nice to me during the entire time that I've known him. He has never eaten blackberries, and he once blew a job interview due to an incident with a chainsaw. One of those things might not be true. You'll have to ask him and find out later. All right, so let's start out with a little bit of background. Let's start out, fittingly enough, with a story. So a number of years ago, I put a very personal essay up on my blog, which I titled, as you can see, On Salvation. And it talks about how I came to become a cartographer. And that was during a very difficult time in my life when I was dealing with a serious depression, the slow dissolution of a toxic and probably abusive relationship, and a feeling of being very out of place in an unfamiliar city and in a graduate program in which I was failing pretty badly. And into this darkness came the light and the joy of mapping, something I was doing as a hobby, and the sense of satisfaction and achievement that it gave me, and sort of a bright spot in those dark days. And ever since then, mapping has been a salvation to me, and I continue to have a very personal and a very emotional relationship with the work that I do. It's very important to who I am, the maps that I make. And so I sort of wrote all this up, and I put it on my blog, and it seemed to resonate with a lot of people in ways that I didn't expect. There were people who were going through similar difficult circumstances, or who had in the past, and appreciated hearing a story about somebody else who had this kind of connection with work and who had also found creative expression to be a positive force in their life. And so it got me started thinking about the power of these stories and the value in sharing them. If we fast forward a couple of years, I was co-editing the second Atlas of Design, and we featured this lovely map by John Nelson, right? And Atlas of Design contributors also include an essay accompanying their work, and John put together a little essay talking not only about some of the details of this map's construction, but also where it placed in his life, what it meant to him personally, and how this work was a watershed moment for him, a time when it became more comfortable to be creative again after a long cartographic silence grieving the death of his mother. And I was very moved by John's story, and I thank you for sharing that with everybody. Oh, thank you. And again, it was sort of this reminder of the power of telling these stories and how it's important to hear these kind of things because lots of us go through these kinds of circumstances and draw power from our work. And so John and I got together, and with our powers of awkward, vulnerable, emotional sharing, we put together a Cartographer story, which is a website you can visit at acartographersstory.com. And we have a little thing there called the prompt, which pretty much encodes what the project is about. The basic idea is that none of us are alone in having these kinds of feelings about our work. Most of us have some sort of emotional or personal relationship with the work that we do in one form or another. Most of us aren't just here because of the money. Right? We could get jobs making more money doing other things. There's something else that drives us, and we invest in our work, and it invests in us, which is a great phrase that John has put together. We put our time and our effort in, and in exchange, the work we do can give us joy or peace, or sometimes frustration and sadness, or it can represent something that's missing in our lives, or some person that we can't be with anymore. There's a lot of complexity that can go on, and I think it's very important to talk about. We have a very good system of technical education. Think about this conference. There's people talking about how to do this in JavaScript, that in Photoshop, etc. And that's great, but I often want to sit in those sessions and ask questions like, so why did you make that map? I understand how you made it now, but was this about a place that was important to you? Does it represent some person in your life, or is something, some sort of joy you want to share with other people in spending your time making that detailed map? We need more emotional education. We need everybody to understand that they're not alone in having these kinds of feelings, and that there's strength and power and learning to be drawn from them. So that's kind of why we put this thing together.
So I like to think when something like this happens, where does it fit within the culture that we're surrounded in, that we're immersed in? And maybe one of the few things that I remember from my undergraduate macroeconomics course was this concept of the Platonic motivators, right? There's wealth motivates us, and honor motivates us, but also there's some mysterious element that motivates us intrinsically that he calls truth or justice, right? And so I think about this, and I think for the last 50 or so years, right, we've been under this impression of, I've been there, done that, this rejection of pillars of truth, a bit of cynicism, and things can be shared, but it's ironic and kind of meta and self-serving a little bit. And I think that's been changing in the last few years. I see little blips of philosophical notions. One of them is called new sincerity. And I think this sort of thing sort of fits into that a little bit, not in any planned sense or intentional way, but when it happens, I kind of look at it and I wonder, where does this fall within the context? And I think that's kind of the direction that it's pulled me in my thinking. So I encourage you to check that out. New sincerity, give it a Google.
John's our resident philosopher in this project, so he comes up with that sort of
armchair.
Yeah, armchair philosopher. Yes. So what I want to do is we're just going to share with you a few excerpts. We're going to drop you right in the middle of some of these stories, so you can get a taste of the kind of things that are on the website. And if there's not going to be any context, pulled right from the middle of stories in order to tempt you to go read the whole thing on the website. So this first excerpt is by Cartographer story number 7 by Vanessa Knopka-Wetzel. And as she says, my time in Ulaanbaatar was so filled to the brim that all I thought about while I was in Mongolia was the job and what needed to be done. I just took every minute as it came and didn't do much self-reflection. Internally, I was still wondering if I was worthy of being there. But eventually, when I took the time to look back, I clearly saw that I was. I hadn't just helped create a lot of maps that helped a lot of people, but I also proved to myself that I was capable of teaching and sharing information. If I could teach people who had never worked in a software before, and also do so while not speaking their language, then I was capable of teaching anything I set my heart to. My moral for this cartography story: sometimes it takes an experience outside of your current comfort zone to really learn about what you're capable of doing.
This next excerpt comes from Ross Thorne, who wrote the 4th Cartographer story. Winter was right around the corner, and my father was still struggling with a simple game of memory. You know, the kind with the face-down cards where you have to flip them and match 2 pictures. He was going to find this. How was he going to find his way around? A GPS was out of the question. Even before his stroke, my dad needed help using a flip phone. I finally saw my chance to help him overcome his newly found limitations. Mapping was the answer. I was excited. I was finally able to help my dad after all that had happened. I implemented all that I knew into making a useful map for my dad that would allow him to do the things that brought him security and joy. With his recent condition, I think he yearned to feel useful again, and so did I. It was, and still is for me, hard to see someone I love struggle with tasks that I can do without having the ability to enable them to do it themselves.
This one is from Jonah Adkins. I still actually like the trail map. I even allow myself to glance at it regularly with a small print in my office. Though it's never sold a copy and the park pretends it doesn't exist, I'm okay with all that, really. When you have a great data set, a place you love, and some personal attachment, it makes it so much better to be up at 1:30 a.m. on a weekday, learning something new and having fun doing it. The personal growth and wealth of knowledge I've gained over the few years I've spent on this project has paid back 10 times in other projects. At work, I generally don't get too much exposure to new things or the opportunity to spend hours crafting my next cartographic mistake. So this continual self-taught learning is super important to me. The older I get, I want to avoid stagnation and stay relevant for myself, no one else.
The 10th cartographer story was written by Hans van der Marel. The excerpt is, I must admit, I get a kick out of seeing my work in the wild, especially considering so much of my work, the data wrangling stuff, is more or less invisible. The feeling I had when I walked into the Stanfords in London and saw an atlas I had contributed to, opened on a 2-page spread filled with maps that I had made, is indescribable. But also knowing that millions of people have seen that rain maps filled me with pride. And I guess I thrive on that. I often try to take on projects that have me go outside, out of my comfort zone, a bit so I can learn new things, try out new techniques and new technologies. Perhaps the duality of my work is pushing me towards those special projects, almost as if I have something to prove, which is somewhat odd because I don't necessarily have to be on a pedestal.
All right, so that just gives you sort of a sampling of the material that can be found there. It's a pretty wide variety of excerpts and pretty wide variety of life experiences that we encode on this website. And so what I hope you'll do is take the time to go and visit acartographerstory.com and read through them. And I also hope that you'll spread the word about it, because these stories have no point if no one's going to read them. So not only read them yourselves, but tell everyone you know about it. Tell your colleagues, tell Twitter, tell social media, etc. Spread the word. But also, we need your help in contributing those words. We want you to share your stories with us. You don't have to have gone to Mongolia. You don't have to publish an atlas that ends up in a bookshop. We're not looking for people more interesting than you think you are. We're just looking for ordinary cartographers like you. You know, your story can be, I made a map one time, and I smiled, and it felt good. That's fine, right? That's an emotional reaction. That's taking pride in your work. That's a real thing. Come and talk to us about that, right? There is, one of the points of the project is to realize that it is ordinary to have these kinds of feelings, to get frustrated, to be happy, to all these different kinds of relationships with our work. So we want to hear from ordinary people who maybe don't think that they're special. All right. The other thing, too, is if maybe you're not certain about how to contribute, right? What is it in my life that might indicate this emotional relationship with my work? Part of the reason we need this project is we're not always good at tuning in on that. So if you're not sure, come and talk to us. Send us an email, visit us here at the conference, and maybe we'll ask you some incisive questions that might get you at the point of that and start you down the path toward a contribution.
So specifically, how do you contribute? In addition to why, let's crank out some hows. So acartographersstory.com. It's important that you don't type the apostrophe for cartographer's story when you're actually entering the URL into, which I don't think I've actually typed in a URL directly into a browser in maybe a decade. So you can find it this way, at cartographersstory.com. There's an anonymous submission form where if you don't want Daniel or I or anyone to know who you are and you want to submit an anonymous story, then there's an option for you to do that. Actually, Daniel and I will know who you are, but we promise we won't share.
Yeah, I guess if you don't, you could use a fake email address.
Use a fake email address if you're actually
no,
anonymous.
The form doesn't tell us who they are.
I don't know who our anonymous contributor is. I thought maybe you did, but
no,
we don't.
I have no
So
idea.
you're truly anonymous.
Right.
You don't even have to trust us. But if you're okay with your name being used and you actually want to show images of the work that you're talking about or other photos that might help tell that story, you can use the email address acartographersstory@gmail.com and just send us a draft or send us an idea and we'll say, yeah, that sounds great. And generally what happens is Daniel and I will look it over pretty carefully. And, you know, maybe if you've got a spelling mistake or something like that, we'll ask you about it or fix it ourselves or something. But generally, we're very welcoming to new content, and we're really encouraged by it. And we hope that, you know, that encouragement is reflected in that story to you folks too.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.